Welcome to Every Friday with Dan and Olivia. I'm Olivia Darbo.
I'm Dan Miles. We're rejoined by our guest from last week.
Yes, hi, I'm Bernard Rose.
Really? I thought you were Prince Charles.
Well, I'm Prince Charles.
Oh, that's right. That's what I thought. I thought you were Prince Charles. Well, I'm the Queen, you see, so you can have a biscuit. It's over there on the left. Anyway, so we're so happy to have you back. And in this particular show, we're now going to talk about what brought you to the States. Your first film was a film called Paper House.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Paper House was a kind of very kind of unusual genre film I made in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. It's based on a book called Marianne Dreams, and it's about this girl who draws a picture of a house and then dreams that she goes to the house and then she draws a picture of a little boy in the window, and she dreams that she meets the boy in the window, and then she falls ill and she becomes very ill with glandular fever, and the doctor that she talks to has a patient who's a boy who's paralyzed with muscular dystrophy, mm-hmm. and she starts to realize the boy that she's meeting in this house in her dreams is the same boy that's the other patient of her doctor's, and she starts to realize there's something very creepy about this house that they're going to in their dreams, and maybe they need to get out of it quickly.
I absolutely love that film. It's one of these kind of timeless films that you can just watch over and over again. I thought the casting of the little girl in it, not only her androgyny, but just she was such a naturally gifted actress. She was so she had a sensuality that most child actors are bereft of. I mean, Natalie Portman had that, I think, in that one of her first films.
And yeah, her name
quite
is
distinctively, but
her name is Charlotte Burke.
Yeah.
And she played the lead in that movie, and she's in every single scene, and it is her one and only credit on the IMDb.
Yep.
She did that movie I think she was 12 when we did it, and she has never ever done a movie before or since. And I think she found the whole experience of starring in a movie at that age traumatic, mm-hmm. and I think that she got very frightened, actually, because the film is very frightening in the second half, and there's all these scenes where the house becomes very dark and menacing, and her father appears with his eyes poked out.
Ben Kingsley.
I'm spoiled. Not Ben Kingsley, Ben
I'm
Cross.
Sorry, Ben Cross, my God. Another blonde moment, but we can't bleep that
Ben
out.
Crossley, not Kingsley.
All right, well,
Ben very Crossley.
His first name's Ben, that's all that matters. I got 10 points out of
That's
whatever.
Right. Who, of course, starred in Chariots of Fire.
Down, 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 down. We know the director of that film.
And
he has a theme song.
Well, yes, of course, your cousin
He's married
Marion.
to my cousin.
Married Hugh Hudson.
They both have theme songs.
They do, yes.
Anyway, but we're sort of giving a bit too much away, I think
you are.
on the air. But we digress. So Ben Cross, who was in Chariots of Fire, had a kind of a scary moment, yes, when his eyes were poked out, I seem to remember in the film.
And so Charlotte got very disturbed at one point when she went onto the set. The set was at Pinewood Studios, and Ben would just sort of pop out of nowhere and smash his way through windows and things like that, and his eyes were poked out, and she got genuinely frightened when we were shooting the movie, and at one point she wouldn't come out of her dressing room.
I don't blame her.
And I said, why wouldn't you come out of your dressing room? She says, it's too frightening out there.
Yeah, and so how is a director not having, well, had you become a father yet at that stage?
Absolutely not. I was 27 years old.
My God, you were just a young little chick.
I was a young whippersnapper.
Yeah, and you're just fresh off the boat. Or you actually hadn't got off the boat yet. You were still
I hate to
in
say
England
this, but isn't part of the idea to have her project fear on camera? It almost help a little bit if a 12-year-old is genuinely afraid for the performance.
That was what was happening. I was trying to make her be really frightened, and she was really frightened, but it crossed a line, I think.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where she was like, I'm so frightened, I won't go back on that set.
Did you find it hard as a director sort of to kind of, it must have been like walking a very fine line between, potentially having paternal instincts. I know you weren't yet a father, but you wanting to be protective of her as directors are of their actors, hopefully, in most cases, but also wanting to get a certain kind of performance, which obviously you did because she was so great in the film.
I mean, I basically had to really reassure her and say, no, listen, when you're in here on the set, this part of the set isn't going to explode. He's not going to jump out of you here, because she was brilliant in that movie because she was so in it by that stage.
Yeah.
So in fact, it was wonderful actually, really, as a director, because instead of trying to say no, be more frightened, I was trying to comfort her.
Yeah.
Which is actually much more.
You say she was in every scene. How long do you think it took to shoot that? Was it a matter of weeks, months?
8 weeks.
So it was like an 8-week nightmare for this poor girl.
Yeah,
Or at least the
pretty
last
much.
4 weeks is like.
The last 2 weeks were full on nightmare for her. Yeah.
Yeah.
And after the film was done, that was it for her.
But there was a certain quality that you were looking for within the casting process, and you did see a lot of young girls, but you were looking for a distinctive.
I wanted somebody
thing.
who was, as you say, very androgynous and very, I didn't want like a Lolita,
No.
I wanted somebody who was pre-sexual,
Yeah, pre-adolescent, exactly.
Yeah. And wanted just so that there was a kind of purity to her,
Which there was. It was just brilliantly portrayed. But I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is where did this sort of the horror aspect of things when did that sort of start to entice you as a filmmaker? Because clearly those seeds were starting to be planted in Paper House. It wasn't as scary as Candyman, but...
Well, I've always loved horror as a genre. I mean, I know that for some critics and audiences, horror is little better than pornography. But I think that, the three kind of supposedly lower genres, which are in ascending order: pornography, horror, comedy, I think they all three have one thing in common, which is that the audience expects a physical, visceral reaction out of them. And if they don't get that visceral reaction out of them, they don't consider they've got their money's worth.
Right.
So, I mean, if you go to a comedy that's not funny, you basically, it's pointless, it's useless. And so if you go to a horror film and you're not frightened, it's pointless and it's useless. And so, that's actually, especially nowadays in the modern world that's full of all manner of horror, it's very hard to frighten people with a film. And especially, the stakes have been upped so violently by the kind of snuff movies that various unpleasant people put all over the internet. It's like, wow, that's a high bar. That's a lot to compete with.
I'm very concerned about my kids being desensitized. My friend Lyle Workman does the music for a lot of Judd Apatow films. He did a Steve Carell movie about magicians, The Incredible Burt Wonderstone. Jim Carrey comes out, he plays like a shock comic, and he does this trick where he like cuts his neck open and pulls a card out. My son, who was like second or third grade, was just, he went, his whole body shook. He's like, horrified by that because it was pretty gross and pretty, but I was kind of like, I thought I'd be able to show it to him because I didn't remember that kind of stuff happened later, the gross out stuff with Jim Carrey. And I'm glad that he reacted that way because I remember, he's just pure and coming up, and this culture hasn't beaten him down yet,
The optimum time to show somebody a horror film is between 12 and 15. And if you show them a horror film at that period of their development in their lives, and it frightens them, they will carry it with them their entire lives. Which is why, as a genre, the audience is so loyal and so kind of devoted, because I think your mind literally gets rewired by, if you see a drama and you come out of it and you go, yes, I was moved, you might forget it a month later. But you see a horror film and if it terrified you and you couldn't sleep, I mean, you will never forget that. It's a formative experience.
Do you consider Jaws a horror film?
Absolutely.
Yeah, don't go back in the water. I mean, a lot of people, they had that shark in their head probably the rest of their lives.
It's a monster movie, completely. Yeah, and a very effective one at that.
And you wrote Paper House, didn't you?
No. Paper House was written by my friend Matthew Jacobs.
Oh, of course. Oh, I love Matthew. And he is also in Boxing Day. He gives such a convincing, compelling performance in that. And so Hans Zimmer, ironically enough, it was his first score ever.
That's right. Well, what happened was, Hans was actually a friend of mine because I'd done two films at the BBC, television films, prior to doing Paper House, and I'd employed Stanley Myers, who was a well-known composer at the time, who I think his best-known work was probably The Deer Hunter.
Absolutely.
Which is a wonderful score.
Amazing.
And Stanley was a very experienced and proficient film composer, and his assistant at that time was Hans Zimmer. And The thing about Hans, Hans's great claim to fame was he was the only guy who could use the Fairlight, which was basically the early version of the synclavier.
I remember that.
Which something which has the computing power of an iPhone, you know.
Right.
But it was a very, very important and holy piece of machinery that you had to operate entirely with like DOS prompts, you know.
Yeah.
And
John Paul Jones had one of those. He graduated from the Mellotron in
That's
Led
right.
Zeppelin to the Fairlight. I remember that very well.
so Hans's claim to fame was he mastered the Fairlight controls, and in fact he worked with Trevor. He was one half of the Buggles.
Oh,
So-
so interesting. So did you make the connection with Hans Zimmer? You know, in the prior episode that we had with you discussing, you know, your musical videos and all of this, your affiliation with music, and did you meet Hans through Trevor having worked
No,
with the?
actually not. I met Hans through Stanley Myers.
Okay.
At the time, he wanted to get into films, so he had sort of apprenticed himself to Stanley and was his composer's assistant. And what that often means in film composer terms is that when Stanley got busy, Hans did the work.
I see.
And I think that happened a lot. And so, in fact, when I was doing these scores with Stanley at the BBC, although I didn't know at the time, I think Hans was doing a lot of Stanley's work.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And so when I did the feature film, I was like, oh, I love Stanley. I love working with Stanley. I want to hire Stanley. So I hired Stanley. And of course, Stanley was like, fuck off, Hans. I'm doing this one. and then when the score came out, it was like, I mean, actually, I liked a lot of what Stanley did, but the producers were not crazy about it. And they kind of wanted Hans to make it more, to use that dreadful leaden word, modern, you know. And so you know, Hans rewrote most of what Stanley did, and by that time we'd run out of money, so Hans did it all on the synclavier, so it was all done in like 80 string pads. But Hans was the master of that machine, and he was the only person. It was very hard work to make it sound okay back then.
Right.
But Hans knew how to do that, you know, and that was his thing. And he did the score for Paper House, and he shares the credit with Stanley, actually.
Wonderful. So then how did Candyman come about? Because that was really the film that brought you, probably you were maybe 30 by the time you came to the States.
Yeah.
Or maybe younger.
31.
Yeah. So that was you were sort of ready to come to the US of A, so to speak, and make, what was considered, I mean, it still is considered in retrospect a big budget studio film.
Well, it wasn't an expensive movie. I mean, and it was picked up by the studio rather than made as a studio film.
Oh, okay.
I mean, what happened was I met Clive Barker when I was at Pinewood shooting Paper House. He was shooting a film, a horror film that he was directing, and we had lunch in the studio one day and got along. And he'd seen Paper House, and he was very
intrigued.
He liked Paper House very much, and so much later, I was sent actually by my agent a different horror film of Clive's, an adaptation of a different short story of Clive's, and I read it, and I wasn't crazy about it, but they also sent me the book of the short stories that it was in, and the next short story in this anthology of short stories was The Forbidden, which is what Candyman is based on, and I read that short story and I thought that would make a much better story. So I called up Clive, who I knew, and said, look, I'm going to pass on this other thing, but can I have the rights to the story, The Forbidden? Because I think that's a great adaptation. And he was like, look, if you see something in it, just run with it. And if you set it up somewhere, I want to be an executive producer, but consider yourself to have an option. So I went, and the next day I pitched it to Steve Garland at Propaganda, and he liked the idea very much. I think he liked the idea of doing a Clive Barker film.
Absolutely.
And so I pitched it to him, and he said to me, well, do you want to, who's going to write it? Are you? And at the time I was completely broke.
Yeah.
But I'd never written a screenplay professionally.
God.
So I just said yes, because I thought he might pay me. And so he went, oh, okay, great. And they made a deal with my agents for me to write the screenplay, and I went back to England to write it. And while I was in England, my then agent called me up and said, Steve Garland is really upset with you. And I said, why? Why is he upset with me? He says, you told him that you wrote Paper House. I said, I never told him I wrote Paper House. My friend Matthew Jacobs wrote Paper House. And he goes, well, he doesn't want to hire you to adapt this short story because you've never written anything before.
Yeah.
And I was like, I need the money. And he gave me a contract. No, you have to tell him that. Tough luck. So they called back and they were going, you made a deal with him. You can't renege on it. It's your fault. He never told you he wrote Paper House. You just assumed it. This is before the IMDb.
Right.
And so by now, it was 4 weeks after I'd gotten back. And actually, because I'd never written anything before, I got down to work right away, and I was terrified. And I was working,
churning it out.
Yeah,
on
and
fear
actually,
or on inspiration and fear.
Both.
A little of both. Yeah.
So my agent called me back and he said, "No, I'm sorry. There's no way that he's gonna give in on this. He still wants to make the film with you, but you have to hire a writer. Why don't you hire your friend Matthew Jacobs?" I said, "Well, look, whatever. We can do whatever. I've already written the script, though." And they were like, "Well, then."
Let's have a look at it.
And send it over. So, I had to have it typed up. I had to have it shipped over to my agents, and had to go by courier, and that took at least another week and a half. And my agents read it, and then they called up Steve Garland, and they said to Steve, you're right. He shouldn't have given you the impression that he wrote Paper House, and you don't have to stick to this deal.
I see what's happening here.
Just send us over a quick claim saying that you have no rights over this
We
script.
want it now because it's good.
and he was like, you send me that script right away. I own it. You get it over. And they were like, we're not sending it to you till you send us a check. It was one of those. So he sent the check over right away. They sent the script over to him. And then Steve Garland called me up like a day later, because of course he read it right away because of all the theatre that had gone on now. He read it right away and just basically said, well, get on a plane, come out here and we'll do it. And it was really that simple. So I came out here and we just made the film.
And did you know at that stage, having adapted it from a short story, which you certainly have an affinity for because you've proceeded to make other short story adaptions from Tolstoy to, the list just goes on and on. But did you know that it was going to be a sort of just a straight up horror movie? Or did you?
Yes.
You always knew that?
I always had, like I said, my thing about the horror genre is, yes, it's true that most horror films, let's say 99% of horror films are not ambitious, and they're trash.
Cliched.
And they're cliche, and they're just killing teenagers, whatever. But the 1% of horror films that are not that are the best films ever made, like The Shining,
Yeah, absolutely.
The Devil.
What do you think of Halloween?
It's a masterpiece.
It's mostly about tension more than actual violence.
It's just people walking around a suburban subdivision, and it's terrifying.
Exactly.
And it's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pure cinema.
That's the 1%. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so those films that they're enduring, and they're masterworks, and they're made by the best filmmakers. Like Ingmar Bergman made horror films.
Yeah.
He made The Hour of the Wolf. Fanny and Alexander is a horror film. I mean, it's the greatest Roman Polanski, obviously.
Yeah. Rosemary's Baby.
For example,
Kind of
The
scary.
Tenant, brilliant movie. Repulsion. I mean, and of course Hitchcock. So I think that yes, I wanted it to be a horror film, but I wanted it to be. I was definitely
In an urban setting.
I had
I mean, the
ambitions
fact
for
that
it.
was
Yeah.
Done in Chicago in a sort of.
Well, it's set in
the projects.
Candyman is set in a housing project in Chicago, and the original short story was set in Liverpool.
Interesting.
And I wanted to change the setting to America to make it more commercial, I
Well, it
guess.
certainly worked.
And so then I actually went to Chicago to do some research, and I was shown around. I said to the people in the film commission there, who said, well, what's a really gnarly housing project? And they went, oh, well, you mean Cabrini Green. So I was taken around Cabrini Green, which at the time was it was a housing project right by downtown Chicago that had become a kind of scandal, a public scandal, because they'd lost control of it, and it had become infested with gangs, and it had become like extremely dangerous, so dangerous to the point where a lot of people wouldn't even drive in the roads that were alongside it, but they were right by downtown Chicago. So it was an eyesore that was public and an embarrassment to the city of Chicago. So much so that I think the mayor of Chicago one of the mayors had actually gone and moved in there as a sort of protest to show that that you could survive it, kind of.
Right. Yeah.
And it became a whole thing.
And let's talk about, again, another controversial situation for you as an artist, because what transpired, I believe, with that film was, based on where it was shot, and there was a little bit of an outpour of, there was some resistance.
Well, because of where I shot it, it suddenly became clear to me that the ghost who was haunting this housing estate, because I think what was clear in the original short story was that in the modern context, instead of us being afraid of Gothic houses or cathedrals or empty ghost-ridden places, what really terrifies us is poverty.
Yep.
And inner city decay and neighborhoods where we feel unsafe. And that, in the modern context, is the most frightening thing of all. So once I'd been there to Cabrini Green and been around it and seen, yes, indeed, it was terrifying there. And the people who lived there were afraid a lot of the time too. And that seemed like a really good arena for a horror film, a place where you were just genuinely afraid just by going there. And of course, at that point, the ghost, the Candyman, had to become an African American, which was, as you say, extremely controversial, because people said to me, you can't do that. And I said, well, what do you mean I can't do that? Why can't I do that? Why would he be white in Cabrini Green? I mean, it's just wrong. Are you telling me that a black man can't play Dracula?
That's what made it so cool.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's like, what are you saying? Are you saying that like somehow and I think that there's a kind of misunderstanding that went along with that, which is that when you make a horror film, the villain is actually the hero. In a weird way.
Absolutely. And boy, what a hero Tony Todd played in
was
The
amazing.
Candyman. I mean, he's still to this day one of the most famous, Halloween characters.
Well, he is, and you know what I think is it was very controversial at the time, and I had to sort of explain myself
And contend with that while you were shooting.
Yeah, in retrospect, what I think is really shocking is that nobody else has done that since.
Now, was the concern that the black community would be offended, or that white people would be offended on their behalf? Because I see a lot of that.
I think people were concerned on both counts, and
Yeah, okay.
and in fact, the the African American community embraced the character.
This is what happens because the show Living Color, they would do things on there. They'd have gay characters like Men on Film, or they'd have Handyman, who was a handicapped guy, or they'd have these things that people who weren't in that group would jump in there and criticize them for. You can't make fun of the handicapped people. You can't make fun of the flaming gay guys. But the flaming gay guys loved that sketch, and the handicapped people said, "We just want to be made fun of we want to be treated like everyone else."
Well, the worst thing for anybody is to be invisible.
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
and I think the other thing was.
Good point. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is that Candyman as a character, he's actually a very proud, educated, strong character. Yes, he's brutally violent, but so is Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
But he's also romantic, and
well, there was an intense
and he's beautiful.
There was an intense heat between the Virginia Madison character and Candyman, and I'm interested. I have heard rumors that you lured Virginia Madison as an actress. You would just sort of put her into a trance to get her to do certain scenes.
That's actually true. Yes.
Okay, so it's not a rumor.
No, it's actually
You
true.
said it first, right here on TMZ.
What happened was when she meets the Candyman in the film. You call the Candyman by saying his name 5 times in the mirror. Actually, something I would challenge you to do. Mm-hmm.
Me?
I wouldn't do it if I were you.
Really?
Would you say his name 5 times in the mirror?
Absolutely.
Because you might enjoy Tony Todd appearing.
Candyman, 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 Candyman.
You will see Tony late at night when
Oh
you're
my God,
turning
there
up
he
the
is.
There he is.
Oh, he's bloody tall and everything. He's just as tall as I thought he was.
Tony
Completely
is very tall,
bald.
by the way. I went when
He's lovely.
when the Candyman appeared to Virginia, I didn't want her to scream and carry on. To me, it was like it was like she was in an alternate state of being, like in another mindset.
Right.
So I wanted her to kind of be in a trance.
Yeah.
So I had this idea. Well, why don't I hypnotize her? Then she won't blink and she'll just do things that are very unusual. Mm-hmm. So Virginia and I went to a hypnotist who put her in a trance, and while she was under, I was there while he put her under. He gave me a word so that I could then put her in a trance any time when he wasn't there. And I was like, I must admit, I was a little skeptical.
Right.
And I thought, well, we'll see. So the first time I try it, I'm there and I go there and I say, let me try and put you in a trance, Virginia. I'm going to say the trigger word and you're going to go into a trance. And she went, okay. And I said the trigger word, which I'm not going to tell you. Mm-hmm. And bang.
There she goes.
She went out like a light.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow.
Wow. I got the power.
Wow.
Look at that.
Wow.
So hypnotism is a power of suggestion kind of thing. She did it to herself via his methodology.
Absolutely. And, it was a powerful enough situation when we were there in the film, and I was like, I'm not going to give you the suggestion word. And she would
Go right there.
She would go. And and I'm sure to some degree it was her. Obviously, it was very much something she willed on herself because she wanted to do the movie. She wanted to be in the movie in that way, in that kind of different state of mind. And it actually was very effective for a lot of times. And it meant also partly why I did it. And it was because when I was going to put her in the trance, everybody had to be quiet on the set, and everybody had to shut up and go away and not be staring. And you know what? You should do that every time someone's doing a difficult scene, because it really, what it really meant was that we were running the set for the actors, not for the grips. And that happens way too infrequently, as I'm sure you're profoundly aware.
Oh, I am. And I'm also profoundly aware of the relationship between a director and an actress, or any of the actors that he has. It's a very, that whilst he's sort of being the captain of the ship on set, it's an important relationship to establish, not only with the actor, but also for the crew. You're setting the tone.
That's right.
And
You're
I remember
saying
seeing
you have
some pictures of you, actually. You almost had like a Houdini look on your face.
No, it was the old
There's a
Svengali
lot of magic
thing.
going on that set.
There was. It was a bit like that.
But that's not all that was going on there, mate.
Well, I can tell you it was.
So the movie ultimately ended up being a huge success. I mean, it was clearly very well cast and very well received and made a lot of money. Did you know prior to making the film that Philip Glass was going to be the composer? Did you hire him afterwards based on, the feedback that, or the, you then got a studio release, obviously, and
Well, no, actually what happened was when we were about halfway through the film, one of the producers, Alan Poole, said to me, "Who do you want to do the score?" And obviously Hans was still my friend, so I thought about Hans, but Hans had just become so expensive. I mean, in the intervening years, he'd won 15 Oscars and God knows. I mean, now if you want to hire Hans now, you have to take 3 trucks of money around to his house, and
he's risen to the top. That's
he
for
has,
sure.
and has been there for 25, 30 years now, and so. So I said, well, what I'd really like is somebody like Philip Glass. And it just so happened that Alan Poole had worked on Mishima, the Paul Schrader film, which Philip did the music for. And so he knew him. So it was one of those fortuitous things. I said, well, call him up, I mean, at the time, Philip hadn't really done many scores, and he'd certainly never scored a mainstream movie. I mean, Mishima was the closest he got, but he'd done Kind Scarzi, obviously, which wasn't a mainstream movie. It was just basically a poem that he put the music to, and of course he'd done a lot of operas like Einstein on the Beach and Akhenaten and all the various operas that he'd done at that point. So he'd done a lot of dramatic music, but it was for the stage, and so Alan called up Philip, and Philip came and saw an early cut of the movie, and this was back in the day when film cutting, when he would show an early cut, it was very long and there'd be no sound. The sound would click in and out all the way through, and it was always exceptionally slow and very kind of not how the finished film would turn out. Whereas nowadays films look more finished, right from the get-go.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is a big problem, by the way, but
Definitely.
we won't get into that. So Philip came and saw the film in that state, and I think he really liked that because he was used to composing operas and art films.
Well, he used to be a cab driver, Philip Glass.
He did,
and I just think that.
But he was at Juilliard while he was a cab driver.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, I think what's interesting
Minor detail
about certain artists. I mean, the smart thing I think for artists, the greatest artists that I've ever known have never, they've never let their feet come off the ground too much where they're not constantly in contact with, the common folk. Do you know what I'm saying? They stay like the folklore because ultimately our job as artists is, to see what's going on around us and regurgitate it back through our art. And so I'm sure being a cab driver, and a musician sort of helped him, in certain aspects. So he probably thought there was something rather disarming about your film.
Well, I think he liked it, but like I said, it was definitely in the very rough version. So he went away and he said, "How do you want to do this?" And I said, "Why don't you just compose a suite, demo it, and I'll use it to cut the film, and then we can, fix it up later." So he went, "Oh, great, that sounds fabulous." So he went back to New York. He composed the music for the film basically and sent it to me demoed. Michael Reisman demoed it for me, and who's his producer, conductor, orchestrator, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I had a cassette tape basically of what he was going to do. We used it to cut the movie till we finished the movie, and then Michael came in and took the edited versions of the tracks that Philip had given me, and conducted the musicians made the proper recordings of them and produced it, and we finished it. And we finished the film, we mixed it, and the film was released. And so Philip, I don't think, saw it again until he wandered into a theatre in Times Square and saw it with a very rowdy audience.
Wow.
That were yelling at the screen.
I bet.
Like talking back to the movie.
No better audience, I'm sure, for
and
anybody to be part of.
And Philip came out of the screening. I think he'd taken a bunch of his fancy New York friends in there with him, and they came out and they were all like, "Oh my God, Philip, you've made a horror film!" And so he called up Alan in a kind of high dudgeon and said, what have you done to this movie? It's like a slasher film. and Alan was like, well, no, it was always going to end up like that, but he didn't get it. And so for years, he was kind of a bit embarrassed about it, and he never put the soundtrack out on disc of any kind, and it was not available or anything, and he sort of disowned it. And many years later, when I was doing, in 2009,
Yeah.
so a long time later, I was making Mr. Nice.
Right.
And I was contacted by someone in Philip Glass's office, and they said, you're making this film about Howard Marks, the guy who invented the marijuana business, and Philip would really like to do the music for it. And I was like, well, I'd love to work with Philip again. So I said yes, and I went to New York to see Philip again. And I hadn't seen him for the 20-odd years in between.
Or Roger Waters, for that matter.
No, that's another part of that story,
Okay.
But just the Philip Glass part of it.
Yeah.
And so I go to see Philip in his place in New York, and we talk about Mr. Nice, and we decide, he's going to do the film. And we're talking about it, and I said, and by the way, Philip, what the hell happened with the Candyman score? Why haven't you put it out on disc? And he went, yeah. He goes, I'm really stupid. I should put it out. And I said, well, why didn't you put it out? And he goes, well, I didn't really get the film when I first saw it. And he was quite honest about it. And I said, so what changed your mind, and why did you suddenly call me up out of the blue and say you wanted to do this again? And he said, well, my accountant showed me the PRS report for that movie, and I was like, oh my God. And he'd been paid millions of dollars over the years.
Amazing. Exactly. Why not cash in on that?
Art versus commerce. Art versus commerce. The eternal struggle.
Your third film, which coincidentally is about a musician who happens to be your favorite composer of all time.
Absolutely, unquestionably, yes.
Beethoven.
Yes.
What was it that sort of made you decide to make a film about one of the greatest musicians of all time, rather than following the success that you'd had for your last two films in horror? What made you want to make that sort of sudden left-hand turn?
When Candyman was like very successful, there's a moment that you get, and you don't get them very often in your life, when you can walk in and say, I'd like to make a large budget film about Beethoven. Because whenever you say that, they look at you like you've just made a mess on the floor. And most of the time, then they make a vow never to ever speak to you again when you say things like that.
Right.
But if you just had a success, you could maybe get heard for 30 seconds. I just thought it was an opportunity, and I thought this could never happen again. So I'm doing this now, and everybody told me not to. And the more they told me not to, the more I'm like, no, you don't get it. This is when you do it.
Yeah.
Because it's never coming again.
Yeah. And you are a bit of an anarchist, which is so great. It shows through in your work. It's sort of, there's this irreverence that I just love. And the casting, I mean, getting Gary Oldman was just, and Isabella Rossellini and Valeria Golino and the other cast of incredible actors that you were able to put together in the ensemble cast is just amazing.
Well, I mean, the thing was for me, Beethoven was always my favorite composer. I mean, I think that it's not an absurd thing to say that he's the greatest composer of all time. I think it's kind of almost a boring thing to say.
Yeah.
And what I love about Beethoven more than anything else is that he's the man who takes music from being, composers were basically servants and performers. They were people, they didn't have the technology, they needed musicians to play in their homes. Mm-hmm. So, all these people were basically well-paid servants. Beethoven, largely because of his physical disability, couldn't earn money that way. Mm. And so he was kind of stuck. There he was, the greatest composer of his generation, and he'd gone deaf.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, but that's a story you couldn't make up. And also when you realize that if Beethoven had stopped composing when he lost his hearing, he'd be a minor composer.
I couldn't agree more.
He'd be forgotten. That all the stuff that we remember from Beethoven came from after he was deaf. All of it.
I mean, and I think what was so amazing, another component that was so incredible about that film is, I think, classical music has sort of gone in and out of being popular. And I'm so glad that there is a classical music station still to this day in every city or big city that you go to at the very least. But through that film, through the visuals and what you were able to depict about him as a man and his story in such an incredible way, you gave this whole other generation the ability to sort of hear his music again. I mean, Ode to Joy, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and
the key thing is for me about Beethoven and about doing a film like that is to try and take classical music away from being something that's stuffy and kind of for like a bourgeois activity when you're too old to do anything else. And to me, I think this is music that has so much passion and emotion and power and actual radical thought in it too. I mean, Beethoven is as revolutionary and radical an artist as anybody.
Prince?
Well, for sure.
Eroica Symphony?
Yeah.
The Eroica, yes, all of them. I mean, he completely expanded what we consider music. I mean, Beethoven anticipates jazz, dissonance, everything.
I don't know if it's apocryphal, but I heard that Beethoven, somebody told him, I don't understand your music. And he said, it's not for you, it's for future generations.
Mm. No,
Did he actually say that?
He said, actually what he said was, you may not understand it, your children may not understand it, but your children's children will understand
there you go. I love the condescension of that, and also the prophecy that it kind of did happen that way.
It really did. I mean, he was right to the very end, completely experimental in terms of how he expanded the language, you know, and at the same time, really nobody has handled an orchestra with as much ease and panache as him, not even Tchaikovsky.
Also, just his piano sonatas, just one instrument. Those are really intriguing. If you just look at the sheet music, like a Chopin etude, it's just, you can see some mathematics in there, and you can see this isn't just, you don't write that by accident.
No, that's right, but I think it's very true if you look at the solo piano music that Beethoven wrote, is that it's not necessarily even to be listened to. He was expecting the listener to be playing it. So I think he was actually kind of dealing in a world where there was an active participation of the listener in the music. Mm-hmm. You know, yes, obviously now we go and listen to concerts of people, Brendel or whoever, playing Beethoven sonatas, but they were when at the time he published them, the idea was that you would sit at home and play them for yourself. As great and extravagant as parts of the music are, there are some really simple, dull passages, even in like the great symphonies. He understands that the worst thing you can do in a piece of music is be brilliant all the way through. Sometimes it's just glue. And I think that there are some banal...
You need peaks and valleys.
Yeah, there are some banal, dull passages in some of the greatest symphonies, which are, you know, you'd never see that in Mozart.
It's like you're refreshing.
Yeah, but it's sometimes he's making key changes or things like that, and he doesn't even want to hide it. He just basically plays the chords, and it's very. Sometimes it's so simple, it's idiotic, but then you realize, no, it's so simple that he's on a plane of thought that you haven't even got to yet.
Tom Whenever.
Hi everybody, it's Tom. I'm just breaking in to let you know that we have reached the end of this episode. As you can tell, between all the great conversation and of course the music, this episode with Bernard Rose has turned into quite the epic experience. So we've decided to split it in two, I guess 3 episodes total if you count the one from last week. So we're going to stop here and pick it up again next time. On behalf of Dan and Olivia, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. And because we are in the middle of a discussion of Immortal Beloved, we're going to leave you with a little Beethoven from that soundtrack. Enjoy.
Even though I had hated him for so long, even though he had tried to destroy me, I went. I had to go. I knew it would be the last time. See him, and I imagined some last-minute insult had sent him running home. Then I saw him. Everybody saw him.